Hello, welcome to the Arabic Hour. This is Waleed Akar. I'm glad to have Dr. Atif Kubursi again as our guest on the topic of economic cooperation between the countries of the Levant, or what is known as the Fertile Crescent. Hello, Dr. Atif.
Hello, Dr. Waleed. Nice to see you again.
Same here. Let me begin with a general question, if you allow me. As you know, regional economic cooperation is supposed to enhance growth and development. A lot has been said and a lot has been written on that by international organizations since many decades now. Do you think that this argument is still valid today?
Yeah, absolutely, Waleed. It doesn't change. Actually, given that the world today is organized in a very meaningful way, in a substantive way, along mass economic organizations that brought countries together. You have the NAFTA, or USMCA, United States, Mexico, and Canada. You have the European Union. You have the ASEAN countries. You have Mercosur. The world is, to a great extent, has taken advantage in a very real, meaningful way of bringing together in a cooperative way economies of the world. In our region, this has not been as effective, as substantive as it should be. And what the argument is, and has always been, that there are incredible benefits and gains to reap from this kind of organizing countries in a cooperative and meaningful way. Not only trade, but investment, labor, and all the other advantages that could come from this.
As we know, recently the Lebanese president has been calling for a common market between the countries of the Levant, namely Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. How do you look at it? And first of all, do you think that this is like a sincere call, or is it more political than economic and social?
Well, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, in the following sense, that, as you know now, Lebanon is facing incredible economic challenges. And one of the major challenges is the financial crisis. And the financial crisis has come about because of dwindling supplies of US dollars, no matter how this has come from fraudulent behavior, from theft, from corruption. Whatever the reason, the situation now is Lebanon is having a very difficult time securing, procuring, sourcing its food, talking about grain, wheat for its bread, meat, and it needs dollars, and dollars are not there. People are beginning to look around. What would be a good alternative? What seems to be a credible, a logical alternative, a workable alternative, in the sense that you don't need to exchange among these countries using the scarce US dollars and all the sanctions that the US has imposed on Syria and derivatively on Lebanon. And the circumstances are such that there are enormous gains that could be reaped, enormous advantages, particularly at this time when dollars are short, to enliven, to strengthen, to empower these countries to exchange and source their food supplies. We're not talking about luxuries without having to have dollars, and where there are mutual gains that could be achieved. The mutual gains, people all know. I mean, the literature in economics is extremely clear and supportive. There are economies of scale that could come from larger markets. And there are economies of scope in the sense that you broaden the basket of goods and services that people could exchange and source. So why not? In 1979, I was working for UNIDO at the time, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the ministers of industry in the Arab world were gathered in Algiers. And the overriding call for this meeting is how could the Arabs lay down the foundations for a better industrial development and capacity to root industry in their midst. And one of the major challenges that were faced is that every country, the Arab world, is too small to mount an industrial capacity on its own. Manufacturing value added, which is the contribution to GDP by manufacturing, in most of these countries was substantially lower than the world average, which was around the 25%, and substantially more in comparison to the industrially developed countries. So the challenge was, okay, how can we raise, and there was something that in 1975 declared in Lima, Peru, which was the meeting of the Industrial Development Organization, and the call was, let's raise the manufacturing value added ratio in GDP of the world by 25%. And so the Arabs really had a chance here because all of them, to a great extent, with the possible exception of Egypt at the time, had a manufacturing value added below 25%. And they tasked me with the challenge is that as an economist, what would happen, what would it take to raise the manufacturing value added in the Arab world to a number that is commensurate with the desired objective and the declaration of Lima. And there was a study by two top economists, Hollis, Chenery, and Taylor. And these took a econometric statistical measure and found out that the most critical determinant of manufacturing value added is the size of the market, which was proxied. They use a variable, the square of the population, to be the variable determining this. If you have a small population, your manufacturing value added, unless you are Switzerland, is quite low. You bring these countries together, you have a larger market. A larger market is a necessary condition to support the possibility of these countries going into industry, because industry is, and manufacturing, characterized by the capacity to reap, to take advantage of economies of scale. So I took every Arab country alone and looked at manufacturing value added and tried to predict it in the future. And lo and behold, even in the best effort, in the best of circumstances, they will really be around what they were with very little promising increase. I grouped these countries together, and lo and behold, the manufacturing value added started to rise. As everything in economics, Dr. Waleed, and you know it, there is diminishing returns. So it increased when I added Egypt and Syria and this, it went high. And then if start adding, the Morocco and other countries, and the curve started to, I found out, and this was purely accidental, no manipulation on any part, just let the data speak for itself, that when you organize the Arab world along natural unification space, such as Al Jazeera Al Arabiya, the Arab Peninsula, Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, the Maghreb al-Arabi. I couldn't believe it. In each and every case, these showed higher manufacturing value added than the component parts on a country by country basis. And what's even more meaningful here is that when I really grouped them all, they did not measure to when I took these separately natural 4 unifications and they added to a larger one. Now, what is the explanation? I'm sure there are substantive real conditions, such as the economies of scale cannot go beyond a particular level, given the technological and development stage they're in. But whatever it was, there is enormous benefits to member countries by abandoning this qatriya, each country alone, to a greater level of cooperation and integration within natural milieu. Why? Because the infrastructure that would allow trade, it does not exist. There are no roads that really connect, say, Iraq to Egypt at the time. There is no real railroads. Given the infrastructure at that time, it looked like the best and most effective and most efficient, in the sense that the lowest cost per unit of production comes from aggregating these economies on a natural basis. So the Fertile Crescent came on top. I was able to show manufacturing value added of the region as a whole is 4.5 times the sum of the component parts.
I would really like to go into that after asking you one question, because we could hardly find an economic region, a geographic economic region, without some kind of cooperation that reaches economic integration. And many times, from Western Africa to Latin America, Central America, the Arab Gulf, and I can mention tens of economic regions, and the very well-known NAFTA and European Union, except for this part of the world we are talking about. Basically, as a result of political reasons, the fact is that such obstacles have grown to become bigger recently, at least in the past 10 years. So don't you think that it's not the right time to ask for such cooperation with all the political obstacles? And I would like to proceed later to the economic obstacles after this question.
Yeah, well, I mean, the story is politics has not been accommodating, in the sense that it did not create the incentives on some of these individual governments, for one reason or the other, to elevate the economic interests of their people above their political limited interests. All right. I mean, those who want to govern Lebanon are worried if they really go with the Syrians that the Syrians would dominate them, or the Iraqis would feel that the Syrians may really have undue influence, or the Syrians feel the Iraqis. This is a case in which the interests of the people should dominate. We're not talking here theoretical things. We're saying to average Lebanese and Syrian that we could double, if not triple, your income per person. Why is it that we do not really take the economic interest to become supreme? All the experiences of successful countries in the world, particularly the Southeast Asian, the what's called the Eastern Tigers. One of the major principles that explain their success is they have been able to concertedly, together, elevate economic interest above and ahead of political factors. And this is something that it is time, especially that we are all facing. There isn't a country in the Fertile Crescent that's not facing challenges. I mean, Fertile Crescent also includes Palestine. And look at Palestine. One of the major saviors that could have come to Palestine or to justify Palestine is the fact that it could reweave its economic interest from its economic depth, which the Israelis have severed. There is always a question, can Palestine form an independent entity? Well, of course, if it can, if it goes and reestablishes, reweave its connections with its economic depth, which is Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. There is really here a situation where if we allowed economic rationality to prevail, if we allow the interest of the people to prevail, their interest, their future, their abilities, their capacities would be multiplied by being together. I mean, look, this whole area, which now the largest is Iraq with about 40 million. If you group them together, they make around 80 million people. That's a major market. This is a market comparable to France, to all the industrial countries of the world. Why not? There is definitely also an issue here. Not only our domestic politicians who are trying to protect their position of privilege and power, there has been historical proofs. You know, there is a statement called the Campbell Secret Document or the Bannerman Secret Document that showed that the colonial powers of Europe have connived, have met and secretly decided that there is a challenge that they should not really allow to come to fruition if the Arab East will become, and the Arab countries become independent and able to work cooperatively, that the whole interest of the colonialists to maintain their colonial power and to maintain their supremacy and dominance, they needed a corollary of this is to keep the Arab people in the East, whether it's from all the way from Algeria, all the way to Syria, they had to remain divided and unable to develop, to rise up to become a challenge. So this is our time. If these people have recognized how important, how powerful, how effective this could become, it's our duty in the East to go back and see why is it we cannot get together and enliven the cooperative forces to take advantage and offer our people economic stability and economic prosperity.
Yeah. Dr. Kubursi, how do you see financial cooperation, for instance, between the countries of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon? I mean, how feasible is it with all the differences in the banking system, the differences in the central banks they have, and the policy making, the differences in the insurance policies, the interest rates, nevertheless, the exchange rates of the local currencies? How do you see it? Is it possible to overcome such obstacles?
Look, if the Europeans who had slaughtered each other in 2 world wars were able to come together and see their interest in having a common currency, the euro, and in making not only a custom union, but even a common market, and where labor could move from one country to other unhindered in order to go and find the best return or best jobs. I mean, if all these people could do it, if the ASEANs could do it, if the Canadians, Mexicans, and the Americans can do it, why can't we do it? What did these countries see as an advantage that we cannot see as an advantage? Okay, I'm kind of quote you some of the numbers that I have now, and what would they be if we were to change? I'm quoting this in the prevailing circumstances as it exists today in splintered, fragmented, fractured countries, each acting on its own. Lebanon now sell 31% of its exports within the countries. You're talking about Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. It imports only 13%. So it sells 31%, but buys only 13%. Jordan sells 20% and imports 3.6% only. Iraq sells 2.6% only within this region and imports 1.6%. The only country that really depends very heavily and sells most of its products into the region is Syria, with 42.3% in 2010 and imports about 13%. Palestine, less than 1% of exports it sells and imports even 0.3 of 1%. And you can tell easily that Iraq was prevented by the Americans who occupied it, and Palestine is severed by the Israelis who illegally continue to occupy Palestine. So there are really incredible numbers despite everything else. Look, if you look at the USMCA, United States, Canada, and Mexico, which replaced NAFTA, the inter-trade within the region is 67.9%. I mean, this is, it tells you that there are incredible economies of scale, economies of scope, advantages that would come from cooperating, from making that market bigger. Look at us in Canada. We're 40 million people or that or about. We are a major producer of cars. And people know that cars, automotive parts, are subject to economies of scale. If we cannot sell in the entire North American market, there will be no advantages. There will be no cost reduction that could possibly come without this market. Now, all of a sudden, Mexico, that was producing a very small percentage of the cars in North America, has become a major producer. And the reason why it has become a major producer, because now it takes advantage of the economies of scale that could come from a much larger market. Instead of being around 100 million, now it really is going into a market that's around 450 and 470 million. In the European, EU, European Union, the internal trade to total trade is 65%. All right. I mean, there is no place you look at whether it is, the only place where we are better, by the way, because we, on average, in the Mashreq, in the Fertile Crescent, the internal trade to total trade is 17%. In Mercosur, it is 16%. If you look at all the Arab countries, it's only 11%. So there are incredible advantages. And I tell you why. One of the major reasons, why this is the case is because of the incredible diversity. All right. At one time, as you know, Syria and Lebanon had a common market under the French. Not common market, to some extent, yes, but let's call it custom union. And Syria specialized in agriculture and industry, and Lebanon specialized in services. Actually, the situation that Lebanon faced once they have dissolved this custom union is that Lebanon was left with an over-bloated services sector with very limited productive sector with very constrained agriculture and industry. Syria was left with a highly bloated commodity producing sector and no services sector. But imagine what the advantages were. You see, Lebanon was really providing all the banking services for the region as a whole, for Lebanon and Syria, all the insurance services, all the medical services of the advanced medical services. And Syria was literally able to sell most of the products, whether it is agricultural products or industrial products. And Syria developed a real meaningful and recognizably important sector in pharmaceuticals, in cloth and textile, in low manufacturing things, so batteries and spare parts and things. But you see, there is really here a situation where Jordan now has become a technological hub. The structure of production and trade in Jordan is that it has really been able to develop a technological suite of products that will be highly demanded in the region. Syria would definitely supply with abundance the pharmaceutical and medicinal needs. Iraq would be able to provide the energy products of all sorts, whether it is crude petroleum, refined product, or petrochemicals. The beauty about the Fertile Crescent is that there is such a diverse sources of production and comparative advantage. I mean, the key word in economics is comparative advantage. Is that if people were to develop along the line of what they could do best, then it so happens that Lebanon could do its best through services, Syria through production of pharmaceuticals and agricultural products and food industry, Jordan technologically sophisticated, or at least relatively sophisticated, and Iraq energy. My God, I mean, you don't find a natural situation where there are comparative advantages in each country in such a way they don't duplicate and don't compete with one another, but can, in a substantive way, help each other, because each would do what it can do best and serve the interest of the rest. In this sense, comparative advantage is that why should I do something that I don't do well when my neighbor can do things they do well? So if I do what I can do best and they do what they can do best, we all can benefit, because each and every one of us will be able to produce that assortment of goods at much lower cost per unit than any one of us trying to do it themselves.
I see. If we move from the issue of capital to the issue of labor, some people argue that economic cooperation could lead to create job opportunities for one country of the region, but on the expense of increase in unemployment in other countries. And they give Lebanon and Syria as an example. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love the Lebanon example. Even we know before anything that happened, every single year, and you know this, Dr. Waleed, Lebanon's agricultural sector, the best fruits in the world that we produce would not have been produced, could not have been produced without the fact of importing around 1 million Syrian workers who came to Lebanon to help Lebanon do that. And it was to the advantage of both. The surplus labor in Syria found jobs in Lebanon, and Lebanon was short agricultural labor, was able to get this labor at a lot cheaper than if it were to divert its labor from the services to agriculture. So this argument I don't buy, in the sense that there is a chance here, especially when I found numerically using econometrics that the manufacturing value added in every part of income is likely to be larger, and not only larger by a fraction or a minor amount, but in some cases multiples of what we exist. These will create jobs. There is nothing really that could create more jobs than growth, than being efficient, than being able to specialize, than being able to coordinate and to leverage your relationship into a win-win with every single partner.
Do you find the infrastructure that is existing in those countries ready for such cooperation? You know, this is a prerequisite, you know, when we talk about roads and highways, and we talk about airports, seaports, we talk about power, electricity, water supply, communication, and transportation. What do you suggest that those countries must work on as a priority in order to facilitate such cooperation?
Absolutely, Waleed. This is really a very important issue. You see, in the early 90s, the IMF and the World Bank had studied really what are the obstacles that prevent these countries from engaging in greater cooperation and more trade with one another. And they found that it was that at that time, the difficulties of transactions, المعاملات التجارية, that the tariffs were too high, that prevented people, and that every time non-tariff barriers, you know, the way you go to the, and you and I must have experienced it, to cross between Lebanon and Syria that are only 40 miles apart, it takes so much time and effort and have to qualify under so many restrictions. They found these were the dominant ones. These were progressively reduced, and the relationships improved under many different agreements. The free trade among the Arabs, GAFTA, the bigger market and things. So these are no longer as dominant. They remain obstacles, but they have become much less of an obstacle. What has become now the major impediment is deficient infrastructure. Exactly the kind of things you talked about. There are no good roads. Yani imagine, for example, among the Arabs, if you want to go to Tunis from Lebanon, it's better that you go to Italy and then go to Tunis. There are far more relationships between, you know, Tunis and Italy than Tunis and every other Arab country. I mean, look at us. I traveled on the road between Beirut and Baghdad. I mean, it's literally an adventure, right? I mean, there is room, and with a greater trade, that infrastructure become more economically feasible. So to some extent, it's a chicken and egg. But what we really need here is an infrastructure that facilitates, that accommodates, that becomes a facilitator rather than an impediment. And if such an infrastructure develops, it would be to the advantage of all. Okay, imagine now, you know, Iraq finds it a lot cheaper and more efficient and timelier to get its products through the port of Beirut rather than to go around the Gulf and come to Basra. So in many respects, there are incredibly good and efficient possibilities here of tying this infrastructure, reconstruct the port of Beirut to serve the region instead of only Beirut, develop Ladia and things from being purely a defense, mooring to an economic node that could supply the area and serve Jordan and other parts in a more economic, efficient, and to the advantage. The whole thing is to find this. It is in the collective interest. It's in the interest of the poor people. Levels of poverty has increased. Our levels of food insecurity have increased. But what better way of dealing with all these issues simultaneously when we can work together, exchange together, and grow together? The potential of joint interest is enormous.
Yeah. You were mentioning at the beginning of the interview, Dr. Kubursi, that if we take the total population of those countries and the area, it will be something like the country of Turkey or France or Spain. And but of course, the per capita income is much lower. Could you please tell us a little bit about the potential when it comes to natural resources of those countries, about the gas, the oil, the water supply? Could you please give the listeners a bit of information about the resources of those countries?
Yeah, one of the advantages of this region, and especially in the context of the Arab world, as you know, the Arab world is notorious for being water short. Water scarcity is a problem. Among the 20 countries the World Bank defines as water poor, that they are below the water poverty line, defined as 1,000 cubic meter per person. 15 of these countries is in the Arab region. It so happens that in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, and Palestine, the potential, actually, the Israelis prevent, the Palestinians from taking advantage of their water. The Turks have really acted in a very spiteful way and have not shared their water in terms of the good riparian rules. You see, the water doesn't have much international agreements, but we have a good agreement with the Turks that they should be allowing water to pass at one place at so many thousand cubic meters per second. Never has been abided by. And what's even worse at now is that the Turks have built the Ataturk Dam and to a great extent reduced the flow of water to the Iraqis and to the Syrians. And the Israelis act as a negative riparian and have not allowed the Palestinians, Jordanians, the Syrians to take advantage. But even with all these impediments, the region, compared to other regions and countries in the Arab world or in the Middle East, is endowed with relatively sufficient water, all right? Which would mean that Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine could grow sufficient food for the region. And that is really something. I mean, look, compare them to the Saudis or to any country in the Gulf. I mean, relatively, we have what we could call, if we are allowed to get our fair share, we have sufficient. And then look at oil. Syria has oil, if the Americans would allow them to reach them. Iraqis have oil, and they have it in abundance. And in many respects, I would presume, I would believe, given the statistics so far we have, that Iraq maybe have more oil reserves than the Saudis. And now that if Lebanese are allowed to get to their own oil reserves, and if Israel does not act as a spoiler, we might be able to talk about this whole Fertile Crescent as a major. We don't have much time, there is a window of maybe 30 years at most to take advantage of these reserves, but you see, they exist there. And then if we don't use them as energy, which we really may, in some respects, threaten the world stability and climate change, there are so many other products that can be derived from gas and from oil that doesn't have to be the polluting one. And then look at phosphate in Jordan. I mean, that would be sufficient for the whole area. Phosphate is extremely important. It's the fertilizer of choice. And then if you really also look at the endowments that we have through history, this region has the greatest historical monuments, footprint that will be attractive to the world, because you're not going to get a better situation. I mean, the whole cradle of civilization is between the Euphrates and the Nile, between the Euphrates and Tigris. And my God, I mean, in Syria, if you dig any time, you find a new city, a new place. There are so many beautiful, great, lucrative resources that once, we have the capacity to freely, independently take advantage of it, if there are no spoilers, the capacity of this region is enormous.
I would like to finish up with one more question. Dr. Kubursi, as an economic advisor, if you were going to give an advice to the president of Lebanon now, what areas do you think are the easiest, if I might say, for economic cooperation? Where do we begin? Given the political obstacles and, given all the arguments you have given and mentioned in this interview, where should we start?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as I said, as when we started, we talked about the financial crisis, and we have a dollar crisis. In Lebanon, there are shortages of dollars. We don't need to go into why do we have shortages. We had abundance, but now we have shortages. I find the capacity to create a currency union between these countries where trade could be effected and could be financed through local currencies by creating maybe one single currency for this region to exchange at its products. That is a fundamental major saving of foreign exchange. For one thing, it facilitates trade, and for second thing, it protects these countries from the interference of countries that have used the exchange rate to destabilize and to impose on these countries conditions and conditionalities that they can avoid. I think there is so much advantage for Lebanon, and there is so much advantage for every country, that if it's our interest and the interest of our people to get really together, they should allow this economic logic, this economic rationality, these economic advantages to become materialized, to realize them, to actuate, this potential. And at the same time, I mean, some of our people worried about sovereignty and about political things. I think they can find ways where they could cooperate on equal basis, respectful of one another's specificities and preferences and choices, and we could learn from each other. I mean, Lebanon has a whole history of democracy, maybe not perfect, but to a great extent, there are so many lessons in each and every one of these countries that could be used in the region to the advantage of the region.
Dr. Kubursi, thank you so much for being with us, and it was a great pleasure, and hoping that we have you again in a coming program. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you.